These are 9 Pokemon cards you need to check out in August 2026. I took a small break from the What to Buy series, and a lot has happened in the past 2 months. Historically, Pokemon cards have a market dip in the summer, and with the last 3 sets that came out, we've definitely seen that. Let's dig a little bit into this and see how it's affected some of the more modern stuff, and also take a look at some of the vintage stuff that I'm interested in. Let's jump right in. Okay, the first card I want to look at is the Meowth EX from Perfect Order, specifically the SIR. This is a card that caught popularity really early in the set, as people consider this a weaker set overall. I personally like it quite a bit. You have cards like this Clefairy here, which is a very solid IR. It helps that I pulled some of the more expensive stuff like the Zygarde Gold card and this Mega Starmie SIR out of a booster box. There's plenty of other good things in here, like this Yveltal. Part of it is that it's a smaller set, especially in relation to some of the huge Scarlet and Violet sets that we were seeing. But I for sure agree with most people in that this Meowth EX stands out as one of the best cards in this set, so the price reflects that. The interesting thing is that for a while it was really jumping up in price. Now this is a fairly expensive card still, $187 Canadian, but for a while it got all the way up to $280 here, which is a pretty crazy jump to the $180 we're seeing right now. A big part of that is the summer market effects that I mentioned, and Perfect Order being a set that's been not picked up by scalpers, which is awesome. It's really been nice. The Pitch Black, Chaos Rising, Perfect Order being able to actually find and get product. We'll see if that continues with the 30th celebration stuff coming out. But regardless, Meowth has had this weird spike and has come back down to reality a little bit, which is nice. I think that's just because people are getting the product, like I said. So you can see over time when it first kind of launched, typically we've seen a pattern of things come out slightly too expensive and then they slowly drop down over time. We can probably see that in, one of the other SIRs like this Mega Zygarde here. So take a quick look at this. It's just steadily gone down over time. I'm fairly certain that Meowth is the only SIR that's bucked that trend in Perfect Order. And I think that makes it an interesting card to watch out for, especially because it's $100 cheaper than it was at this peak already. And you can see that the price is kind of flatlined for a little bit here. It might go down a bit more. It's really hard to predict the market right now because the 30th celebration's coming out. It's going to be pretty crazy, and some other sets that people are excited for coming out after that. And then you get the post-summer kind of push that seems to happen every year in Pokemon card world. So it might be a low point for this card for the next little bit. It's also possible that the whole market crashes down to reality after a multi-month lull where scalpers aren't, hoarding product as much as they have for the past 1.5 to 2 years at this point. Regardless, this is a very interesting chart, and this is a very interesting card. The Meowth is pretty unique for a Meowth card. I'll show you another one later in the video that I think is pretty cool. But it being a more artistically styled card makes it kind of interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of text here. Cool for the card game, less interesting when you have a focus on artwork. That's a balance that Pokemon Company has to strike constantly, which I don't envy. I also wanted to take a look just to prove the pricing that, on eBay, which is a common way for people in Canada especially to have to buy cards of this caliber, card shows, eBay. That's pretty much what we're limited to. Sometimes you can go to Card Trader or whatever to get stuff from overseas, but TCG Player is not really an option in Canada. It's just way overpriced with everything. So it might be a little different in the US for being able to use TCG Player, which is of course owned by eBay. But regardless, we can see that the price has come down. It used to be, if we go back far enough, well, we have a lot of sales, so it's hard to tell, but you can see that the numbers here were much higher. Even a month ago to now, we're starting to see a lot more 180 to 200 kind of things. It's tough because there's always shipping. A lot of these, it's showing me the price that it would cost for me to ship, but they're most likely bought and sold within the States, so they wouldn't have this hit of shipping. Yeah, we're seeing a much more reasonable 180-ish to 200 kind of pricing holding true on eBay, which is a good sign. Then we can take a quick look at price charting to reaffirm what I'm saying. This shows the USD price, $130-ish USD ungraded. Yeah, $420 PSA 10. But it has this interesting start, spike up, come down. That's a $50 USD, more than $50 USD difference from its height here on price charting. And I don't rely on price charting for actual legitimate prices because it especially with vintage stuff or things that have multiple variations. It cannot differentiate well between conditioning and things like that. Really, the thing that you use price charting for is trends. So more affirmation that this trend is happening with the Meowth card here. Okay, I'm going to bounce around from generations here a little bit, but next up, I want to talk about this Misdreavus card here. This is a original Wizards of the Coast promo, and it is goofy as hell looking. I like to include kind of weird artwork, cheaper cards in these videos, just to point out that there's a big split of how you can collect Pokemon cards. Big bangers like the Meowth, and even crazier, you know, like $1,000 to $2,000 cards like Moonbreon and stuff like that. Not that I'm recommending that card. Something like this, which is currently around $15 Canadian, I think is a much more attainable and interesting piece of a collection. I personally don't have this card yet, but it's on my radar to grab. And I think it's totally achievable to get. And to have an original Wizards of the Coast promo, pretty much any of them are interesting. This one came out in 2001, so, 25 years old at this point. And just looked at how goofy this Misdreavus is. You can pop back to just seeing general Misdreavuses, and usually they're much cuter looking, much more kind of dainty and feminine, so to speak. Like this really nice looking hollow Misdreavus from Neo Revelation. And you can see in general, they all kind of mostly look like that. A couple other goofy ones, maybe this one here. But this one really stands out as just being really dumb looking. And I think that's so endearing to have cards like that in your collection. When you take a quick look at the pricing, it's not super important with cheaper cards like this. This was an even cheaper card a year ago, just like most things. It was like a $5-ish card, and now it's closer to 15. You can see it just slowly rose over the past year or so, and it's kind of been steady for the past few months here. I would even wager it's theoretically possible it drops down a little bit, but anything this old is not going to drop down like crazy unless the whole market collapses, and that's really up to you to decide if that's going to happen. Personally, I think there's going to be a downtick at some point, but we're a little ways away from that, and I don't think it's going to crash in the sense that these will be worthless. Pokemon is just too big to fail at this point. Too many people are into it, whether scalpers, investors, actual collectors, things like that. There's just too much propping it up right now. Let's just take a quick look at eBay and see if there's actual attainable copies of this card on there. As a general rule, I often like to start looking at what is sold, and you can see how often a card like this is selling. So we're getting a couple a day, looks like. Yeah, we're sorted by ended recently, so a couple in the past few days here. Currently filming this on the 31st. So it's a card that moves around a lot, which means it's been printed a lot. Most of the Wizards of the Coast cards were printed into oblivion. This was like at the peak, with maybe the exception of now, the peak of Pokemon card collecting. So there was a ton of promo cards like this out there. For example, I have one of the cheapest promo cards, the computer era card. I have like 30 of them, and then the Team Rocket's Meowth, I had like 30 of them for a while, which has now gone up in price, so I've been slowly selling them. Just get those when you buy other people's collections from back in the day. So there's probably thousands and thousands of these things out there that are available, which is why the price is nice and cheap. You can see them moving. Here's one that was LP that was sold for $12. So, if you wanted to be patient, I would wager you could get this card for $10 Canadian, which is like $6-ish USD. Let's do a quick conversion here. $10 Canadian, yeah, $7 USD, which is totally reasonable for a goofy-looking Misdreavus card. Little piece of Wizards of the Coast promo history. I think it's just a cool one to take a look at. If you like this kind of content, make sure you subscribe. I'm aiming to release one of these videos every single month where I look at interesting cards, whether they're interesting in pricing, in availability, in artwork, or things that I think are goofy and think are great additions to collections. You're not going to want to miss those, and at some point soon, I'm going to do a retrospective of cards that I predicted going up or down and see what had happened. So you're not going to want to miss that, and make sure you subscribe. All right, let's jump forward in time a little bit here and talk about a set that is going to be very relevant coming up shortly here. That set is, of course, the 25th year celebration set. I've been very vocal about hating the yellow Pikachu stamp here. I think they could have done it in a, slightly less obtrusive way. I definitely understand that you need to make sure that these cards are not confused for the originals, so it makes sense why they put that in there, and they're doing the exact same thing for the 30th year one. But really what I want to point out is that there's a lot of very attainable cards in this set that I think are interesting and you can get for very cheap. So obviously you have the base celebration set here. It has things like, you know, these legendary Pokemon and a bunch of Pikachus. These are all super attainable. You know, this Chungus Pikachu based on the original base set artwork with the red cheeks here, I think is pretty awesome. I don't mind the symbol as much, it being on the left here. Pikachu is really dominating the card, and it's $8 Canadian, so you can get that for super cheap. And then more of the meme ones, like the surfing and flying Pikachu ones. Really, the only expensive card in the base celebrations things is this Mew, and it's $90, which is still pretty cheap for the expensive card. Now, Celebrations is distinguished in two sets, more or less, the Celebrations and the Classic Collection, and a lot of the heavy hitters are in here. Really, I'm not trying to talk about the heavy hitters. Specifically, there's the Charizard here and the Umbreon Gold Star that are pretty expensive. There's a few more in like the $50 to $60 range, like the Rayquaza and the Shining Magikarp. I would probably recommend trying to get the real versions of those cards over these ones. Oh, of course, these are much cheaper, but for example, I got a Shining Magikarp for $200 that is in very solid condition not that long ago. And it doesn't have this ugly yellow symbol on it. However, what I do want to recommend is two cards in here that I think are maybe cheaper than people would expect, which is the Blastoise and the Venusaur here. I actually just picked up a Venusaur at a card show a couple weeks ago, and I got it for $10 Canadian, and it's in near mint condition. The hollow pattern on it is quite interesting. I think it's a pretty unique take on a card that we've seen a bunch of times. You know, obviously I have a base set Venusaur, I have the Classic Collection Venusaur, and there's a bunch more printed of this specific version of the Venusaur. But for $10, this is a very approachable and attainable copy of the base set Venusaur. So I would absolutely recommend grabbing it. The price, as far as I can tell, has been pretty stable. Yeah, this is a great looking chart here. So obviously it jumped up in that weird peak that we had at the beginning of the year where everything was really expensive. Terrible time to be buying stuff. But it came back down pretty close to what it was a year ago, which I think is great. And part of that is because it has this celebration symbol on here. But I think people are going to start paying attention to the celebration set again because the 30th celebration is coming out. And like I said, I got that near mint copy for $10 cash, no shipping, no tax. That's Canadian, so the $7 USD. So it's pretty close to what the market price would have dictated even a year ago. So a super approachable card there. The same thing can be said about the Blastoise. I have this next up on my list to try and get. I would wager you can get it for no more than $15 pretty easily. And it has a very similar chart to what the Venusaur had. You know, it was a little less than $15 a year ago. It spiked up, maybe not quite. It has a more rounded graph here than the Venusaur did. But it's come down pretty close to what it was a year ago again. And I think the unique hollow pattern on the Celebration Classic Collection fits the Blastoise pretty nicely. Now, the yellow really stands out against the blue here, which does detract from the card. But a base set Blastoise is a lot more expensive than this. We can quickly pop over there to take a look. You can see you're looking at $300. Now, of course, you can get cheaper, lesser condition ones, but a near mint one is going to cost you more than $300. So to get one for $15 or less that is very similar, I think is a great deal. Would I recommend getting both? Yes. I absolutely love having a base set. And if you can get your hands on a first edition or Shadowless for cheap, then I would recommend, but obviously those prices are very expensive for a card. But my complete base set is one of my prizes of my Pokemon collection. So being able to kind of celebrate that collection with some cheaper versions of those, you know, these are nice to display, throw in your binder, whatever, I think is a great idea. So I'd recommend both of these two cards specifically out of the Celebrations collection. But there's lots of other good cards in here as well. You know, getting this Groudon for less than $2, pretty interesting. Rocket Zapdos is a great card. You know, lots of stuff that would be much harder to get from vintage things that you can get pretty easily here. For something like the Dark Gyarados, I actually recommend the pre-release version of the Dark Gyarados instead, because you can get that pretty cheaply for less than $50. I think I got mine for less than $30. And that's the vintage promo pre-release version of the card instead of with this ugly yellow Pikachu face on it. Okay, we're getting up on some more modern cards that I want to point out, but before we get to that, I want to point out some vintage to mid-era cards that I think are pretty interesting. Specifically, I want to look at the Diamond and Pearl set here and some of the cards in it. I'll point out a specific card that I think you should check out, but really it's a vibe thing. So Diamond and Pearl, I think, is a little underrated of a set. There are some super interesting cards in here, like this whole Bonsley card that everyone really loves because it's so weird, and he has this hole in the bottom of him. I happen to have that card just out of luck from collecting in the past. It's kind of expensive for a common card now, but that's not true of most of the cards in this set. A ton of cards in this set are super attainable. Now we have these kind of goofy-ish, depending on what you like to collect, level X cards here. I think they're pretty interesting. They're really like of the time, but you know, they have a bunch going on. I think they fit the era nicely. Diamond and Pearl is kind of an overlooked era of cards. Pokemon was like in a, I don't want to say stagnant, but stagnant-ish, you know, phase of collecting. And maybe more interestingly, it's coming off the back of like true vintage tier cards with like the EX era of cards. So they, like, if you pop back to EX cards, they look vintage for sure. These cards, although they look maybe a little dated now to what we have from Scarlet and Violet and onward, they set a trend for the next like 10-ish years of how cards would roughly look. And I think because of that, people actually underrate them a little bit. The holo effect on these cards, I think, is actually really nice, and it balances really well with the Pokemon style that they had here. And lots of cool cards in here. You know, this Gengar, even though it's not a holo card, I think is really awesome looking. It would be sweet if it was a holo card. Of course, we can get the reverse holo. I just took a quick look on eBay, and you can get this card in reasonable condition for like $50-ish. You can get like a low LP version of the card. Now the reverse holo, similarly, you can get an LP for 150 to 200 range if you really like that Gengar. But the card I want to kind of point out more interestingly is this Infernape. I'm going to show off some of the cards I have because I have a bunch of cards from this set already. I have the holo and reverse holo from this set for the Infernape. So I think it's useful to use this one as the example card. You know, at $31 and $25 as one of the rarer cards in the set, because holo rares were like a near the top tier rarity at that point still. Obviously we have the level X cards, this one right below it. Totally reasonable price points. You can see over time, obviously it went up with the market. We can just look at the holo here on its own, from 10-ish to $30-ish. But you can still get this card in great condition for $15. I've seen, if you take a quick look on eBay, you'll see a bunch of copies there that are like that. People aren't looking for these kinds of cards right now, and I actually think that's a good reason for you to get them right now. You know, an almost 20-year-old card. At some point, the people that grew up on Diamond and Pearl are going to come around and try to complete these sets, and I think that's soon. We're already seeing the uptick with the general market, so that's already in play. And in general, there's a ton of cool cards in here, so I just absolutely recommend it, like Palkia and Dialga, Lucario, Luxray. These are all like fairly popular Pokemon. Cheap Empoleon, the Dusknoir over here are quite cheap as well. Like lots of cool holo cards and lots of cool non-holo cards. It's a very approachable set in that sense. Now, if you're collecting the reverse holo and holo every card in here, it's going to start getting expensive. But otherwise, I think it's a great choice to kind of grab lesser known cards like this. Okay, for the final chunk of cards, I'm again going to show multiple cards. It's kind of a theme of this video where like chunks of cards are become relevant all at once. And the set I'm looking at here is Phantasmal Flames, and for one very specific reason. Obviously, this is a great set. It has like one of the best Charizards created. This is probably a top 10 Charizard. Some people would put it in their top 3, maybe even favorite. I think it's really awesome. It has the whole evolution chain in there. The artwork is really cool. The red to blue coloring is really cool. What's not really cool is the price. Obviously, that's crazy expensive. It's starting to level out and even go down a little bit. But it's not a card that I'm going to pick up for that price. I'd much rather get one of the vintage high rarity cards instead. But there's a major benefit to having a super expensive Charizard, really two quite expensive Charizards if you include this gold Charizard in here as well in this set. And that's that all the other SIRs are actually way cheaper than you would expect. So you can see that there's only 5 SIRs in this set and a bunch of cool IRs, which is not really the point of this, but like this Meowth is really awesome, the Ambipom. Like a lot of these really cheap ones are really cool. But if you look at these 4 other SIRs, these are cheap for SIRs. So a lot of the other Scarlet and Violet sets have SIRs that don't get much cheaper than Scarlet and Violet and Mega Evolution, I should say. Have a lot of SIRs that don't get cheaper than like $60, and that's like already quite cheap. Most of them are $100 or more and multiple $100. For every other SIR in the set to be this cheap is kind of crazy. Dawn being the one I'm least interested in, but still interested in. I think it's a solid trainer card. People like Dawn. I don't typically prioritize picking up trainer cards until I'm like completing out a set. But for $30-ish, this card is super attainable. You can see that it started way higher when the set first came out at 130, even like, the weeks after it was in the $80-ish range, and it's just been dropping ever since. So at some point this is going to level out, and I would say SIRs don't typically get cheaper than $20 Canadian, which is like $14 to $15 USD. So it's probably pretty close to right around now where it's leveling out. But we have 3 others that are similar. So that's actually the most expensive of the 4 other SIRs. We have this very cool Lopunny card here. I actually picked this one up recently as well, right here. And I got it for pretty much right on this price, $23 or $24. It was a couple weeks ago, so the price I think at the time was ever so slightly higher. Yeah, it would have been somewhere in this chunk of time here. But you can see a similar story where it started out much higher because SIR people were really loving Phantasmal Flames. There wasn't a lot of product right away, but a lot of Phantasmal Flames has come out. So people chasing the Charizard have ended up pulling a bunch of these, driving the price way down. And that's basically a win-win scenario for collectors trying to complete out sets like this, because you can get cool and expensive or cool and high rarity cards for quite a bit cheaper than their typical counterparts. The Mega Lopunny, solid looking artwork. I'm not a crazy fan of Lopunny here, but I think this is a good artwork. It fits the set quite well, especially in conjunction with some of the other SIRs and IRs in here. I think Sharpedo was probably my favorite. It was the first SIR I ended up grabbing. I got it for around $30, and this was a couple months ago, so I still feel like that was quite worth it. It has, mirror the same kind of pricing trajectory. It started in the $80-ish range and now down to below $30. Would absolutely recommend taking a look at that. And then Rotom, I actually think, is a little underrated. He's like a kind of mediocre Pokemon, but I think if you like quirky cards or quirky Pokemon, I think he's one to grab. So I have him on my list of stuff to grab. I have the Mo Rotom here, which I always think is funny. I picked up a Mo Rotom IR or trainer gallery card a couple weeks ago as well. Similar story. Started out, in the $60 range as one of the lesser, as probably the lowest tier SIR in this set, and kind of dropped down and leveling out in the low 20s. Oftentimes with modern cards, it's harder to get cheaper than market price for them because there's not, you're not going to get an MP Rotom EX. There's in worst case, you're getting an LP to someone, there's some factory error or someone accidentally dropped it or something like that. Those are pretty rare. I wouldn't be surprised if you could find this card for $20, especially if you're going to card shows and hunting around. People are not like actively seeking out these 4 SIRs. Really, these 3 I'd say. Some people are seeking out the Dawn. So throwing these in deals and stuff is a good way to get SIRs. Phantasmal Flames, if you ignore these 2 Charizards, is like a really good set to just absolutely hammer through and get a ton of cards in. You can see, I love this Zacian card here, and a bunch of sub $5 IRs and stuff in here, and then really cheap SIRs makes it a mostly obtainable set, which I think is awesome. And these are solid SIRs, like I said. I think the Sharpedo is a solid rendition of Sharpedo, and I would absolutely recommend. All right, there we have it. 9 cards that I think you should buy in August. Obviously, we talked about way more than just 9 because we're in context of sets and stuff. But I think you should actually pay attention to the celebration stuff happening. Things like what's happening in Phantasmal Flames is happening in other sets where there's like a high-end card and a bunch of cheaper SIRs. Those are very expensive to pull yourself because there's like a 1 in 80 pull rate or whatever it is, which, even at $5 a pack is hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So you can get them for way cheaper. I think that's a great way to engage with collecting, even in the modern cards, which has been difficult in recent year and a half or so. So, yeah, I really appreciate you guys watching. Make sure you stay tuned and subscribe for my next video coming out where I'm trying to repair some vintage cards that I bought for really cheap.